So I went to MIFF this year and saw quite a lot of films, 13 in total, and I thought I'll do a video giving my thoughts on what I saw. I know I said I was done doing reviews, but part of the reasoning behind that was to explore powerful sides of film that don't get enough attention on YouTube, and I feel film festivals go under that. A lot of the best films I come across every year are screened almost exclusively at film festivals, and I feel a lot of people gloss over these films because of their lack of distribution. So through this video I hope to introduce you to some potentially interesting films that you haven't heard of. So without further ado, let's get right into it. I was incredibly lucky to get into the Australian premiere for Quentin Tarantino's 9th film, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, presented the way it was intended to be viewed on 35mm film. He is up there as one of my favourite directors, so this was quite a big deal for me. The experience was quite amazing and is definitely something I want to do with more films moving forward. The film itself was pretty incredible. Leonardo DiCaprio and Brad Pitt knocked it out of the park with their performances. This is one of the most well written films I've seen this year. Just about every line works perfectly for what it was going for. The same can be said for the story structure, although I should warn you that it does go some directions that you may consider problematic, considering it is basing itself off of actual people who were working in the industry in the late 60s, but it is very much trying to do its own thing. I was surprised how little screen time was given to all the side characters, especially when they got stars such as Al Pacino and Margot Robbie to be in the film. But I did feel in the grand scheme of things it did actually benefit the film, as we get a deeper look at these characters and how this end to the Hollywood age was affecting them. It was one of the more personal Tarantino films where I thought he had something to say while still sticking to his style of filmmaking, which was what I liked most about this film. Although he's made some incredible films, they don't really have much to say, where I think this film differs in that respect. I was surprised to find it went for 160 minutes, as for me it was so perfectly paced that it barely felt like it went for 2 hours. It is also incredibly well shot, leading to some remarkably memorable scenes. It contains that visual aesthetic and overall feel of most films from the late 60s and early 70s in a way that most other films conveying this time period have struggled to achieve to the same degree. There are very few films in this decade that I am certain will be regarded as classics far into the future. This is one of those few films. I can only see it getting better over time, and that's a very rare thing for me to say. This is the second film I've seen from Spanish director Pedro Almodovar. Last year I watched his film All About My Mother, which I found to be quite fascinating, so I was interested in checking this one out. Once again, I was pretty impressed with how well made this film was. I'm starting to really like his style as a director. His films seem to be structured around exploring themes of identity, mental health issues, and just presenting all of the struggles people go through in life on a very humane level that just about anyone can relate to in some way or another. This one in particular is about a film director coming towards the end of his life and succumbs to taking heroin as a means to cope with a lot of the pain he's been struggling to deal with. It's quite an interesting character study that through some incredible cinematography really succeeds in sucking you into the character's life. I don't know if there was enough there for me to come back to anytime soon, but nevertheless it was an experience worth having. I was actually looking forward to this one, having seen and really enjoyed some films by Jim Jarmusch. Just a few months back I watched Stranger Than Paradise, which I absolutely loved, and also saw Broken Flowers, which although I had some problems with, I still really enjoyed it for what it was. He brings out some very subtle performances by its actors, which although feels very distant, actually adds this realistic approach to the way characters behave. This film, however, serves more as a parody of his own work, which I honestly hated. He places that style of communication and the very subtle and slow pacing of his films into this situation where the disruption of the Earth's rotation causes zombies to rise from their graves. This approach did not work very well in the slightest. On the positive side, this has one of the greatest casting lineups I've seen this year. You have actors such as Bill Murray, Adam Driver, Tilda Swinton and Donald Glover all in this film together, but unfortunately the material they have to work with is just terrible. It contains some embarrassing attempts at breaking the fourth wall that just fell flat for me. A lot of the humour is random nonsense for the sake of getting a cheap laugh, and the pacing just doesn't work in the same way as Jim's other films, just coming off as painfully sluggish. He does play with some interesting concepts around the way the zombies function, having gravitated towards what they did most in their past life, but unfortunately it isn't very well explored, only serving to try and get a cheap laugh in most situations. I should mention that the audience definitely sounded a lot more invested in the film than I was, so I could be in the minority here, but I have to be honest in saying that this is one of my least favourite films this year. Depending on your sense of humour, you might find otherwise, but it's not a film I would personally recommend. If you're looking for something along the lines of this kind of film, I'd recommend checking out Shaun of the Dead. It's a much more effective comedic approach to a zombie film that I absolutely love. You'll have a lot more fun with that film. This is essentially a biopic told through the medium of animation around the making of Lewis Burnell's third film and the difficulties he faced in getting it made. For those who don't know, Lewis Burnell is a surrealist filmmaker from Spain whose work has come to be fairly well respected over the years. At first, his work was seen as absurd and pure nonsense by the vast majority of audiences, but over time, a following has been built that greatly appreciates his films. At the time, very few could really perceive what he was trying to do in making a surrealist documentary, as nothing like that had really been done before. I personally have seen some of his work, most notably his first film, Un Chien El Deux, I think it's called, probably wrong in the pronunciation, and various other documentaries around his career which I found quite fascinating. And it was definitely helpful having seen that going into this. It would have been better if I'd seen the documentary short this film is based around the making of, but I was trying not to expose myself to plot details for any of these films, which in this case wasn't the best idea, but it definitely didn't affect my experience too much. The film itself is directed by Salvador Simu, who has not done anything significant outside of this. This film definitely shows he has talent as a director through creating a fairly original and authentic experience. I've never really seen a biopic told through this medium of animation, and the approach he takes is actually quite interesting, as we experience the process of him creating the documentary as it switches to showing actual footage used in the documentary in the context of it being created at that particular point in the story. Unfortunately, that approach is all the film has going for it. The difficulty in basing the story around Lewis Burnell is that he's a very problematic director who has done some questionable things to get the scenes he wants, especially in the context of this documentary where animals are quite literally killed on camera for possible use in the film. You've got to be careful in the way you portray a character who has done those kinds of things, as it changes the way audiences perceive them throughout the narrative, which in the context of this story makes it difficult to root for his success in any way. The makers of this film very clearly respect him as a director, and that is reflected in the way he was presented throughout the film. For me, this made it difficult to stay invested, as I was just exploring his persona at surface level without going into the complexities associated with it, which I honestly didn't find very interesting. It also felt like it was exploring the less interesting parts of his story, as the elements I found most fascinating were just glossed over through text exposition. This is a film that had some great ideas, but I personally found they were not executed too well. If you're exploring different styles of animation, then you might find this interesting, otherwise I wouldn't recommend it. This is a Taiwanese film directed by Midi Z, a director who I was not awfully familiar with going into this. It received a lot of buzz coming out of Cannes Film Festival, which was what originally gained my interest. The story revolves around this actress's terrible experience where she is consistently abused and taken advantage of on the set of a film. We follow her going through this in a structure that essentially transitions into an art house film. It explores some themes and issues that are rare to see in cinema, likely because many people in this industry have been through these types of experiences. When it explores these issues in a coherent manner, it is actually very effective and shocking to watch. Unfortunately, its creative approach to the structure completely ruined the experience for me, especially towards the second half. This made it incredibly difficult to stay invested in the narrative and what the protagonist goes through. Its structure felt very much inspired by films such as Black Swan and The Neon Demon, but the structure of those films further immerses the audience into the perspective of the protagonist, where in this film it felt like I was being further distant from the character's perspective. It's really unfortunate as it has so much going for it. It's beautifully shot with some decent performances that can lead to some real effective moments, but the messy structure heavily detracts from the overall experience. Not one I would personally recommend, but some may find aspects of it interesting. This is a film that explores the difficulties of an aspiring filmmaker trying to balance her studies and career aspirations with this fairly difficult relationship she is trying to keep together with her boyfriend, who is struggling with a heroin addiction. It's directed by Joanna Hogg, who is someone I was not awfully familiar with going into this, but after seeing this film I am definitely going to be keeping a much closer eye on her work. It's structured like a coming of age film, but with a significantly slower pace that you wouldn't expect from this kind of genre, really taking its time in exploring these characters' emotions and what they're going through. It reminded me a lot of the film Phantom Thread and how the slow pacing in that film really contributes to immersing you into these characters' lives. It's beautifully shot with some of the best performances I've seen this year. It's one of the few films I actually connected with on a personal level and was deeply immersed in the narrative. This is a film I can see myself coming back to countless times in the future, possibly even coming to be a personal favourite of mine. Definitely check it out if it sounds like your kind of thing. This film is an exploration of the struggle of a working class family in England trying to get by in life. Both parents are in a position where they essentially have to live in this incredibly toxic work environment that has no consideration for their welfare, while their kids are also going through their own struggles. It basically explores this situation in the worst possible circumstances imaginable. It's an incredibly difficult watch, but also one of the most effective I've seen this year. I really like the approach they took in the structure, especially some of the editing decisions. It doesn't do anything groundbreaking on a technical level, but displays this struggle in an incredibly effective manner that I would recommend to anyone up for an experience such as this. It's directed by Ken Loach, who has worked on a number of large projects in which I'm definitely going to look into after seeing this. This is another adaptation of the critically acclaimed novel it is based off of, directed by Laj Laya, I think his name is, being his first feature film. My overall experience with this film is coming from someone who hasn't read the novel or watched any of the film or TV adaptations, so just be aware of that. I went into this film excited after hearing the acclaim it received coming out of Cannes, but didn't really know what to expect. Overall, I found aspects of it to be quite fascinating. It was incredibly well shot, having some beautiful cinematography that gives the film this enormous scope that sucks you into the atmosphere of this side of Paris. It takes quite an interesting approach in its structure that leads to an incredibly effective final act. But everything leading up to that final act I felt kinda distant from. Like I couldn't really stay invested into the narrative and the story it was telling. This might come more down to personal taste than the actual quality of the film, but I couldn't really find anything to connect with on a personal level, which made it difficult to care about any of the characters. But overall it does explore some interesting themes in a really interesting way, which I can see many people finding very effective. I wouldn't be surprised if this film builds quite a large following later on in the year once it starts getting distributed in more cinemas, as although it didn't really work for me, I can see why so many people are giving it the acclaim it's been getting. Check it out if you want, it's definitely a lot better than the average film. This is a very over-the-top crime film where these two people get caught up in this drug smuggling scheme and try to get themselves out of the situation. Over the course of the narrative, they develop an affectionate relationship towards each other, which is what the narrative most dominantly revolves around. It's directed by Takashi Miike, who is a very well-known Japanese director that I've always been interested in but never had the opportunity to check out any of his films. After seeing this, I can definitely say I'm very excited to check out more of his filmography, because this film in particular was so much fun. It's got this very satisfying, carefree tone to it, which in its style reminds me a lot of Tarantino's films. It's got some really effective comedic moments that have me laughing out loud, and this very interesting approach in its structure that worked well for what it was going for. It did take about 20 minutes for me to adjust to the overall tone of the film, as I wasn't sure at first what it was going for, but once adjusted there was no coming out of it. It may have some pacing issues that affect your experience with the film at certain points, but if you just want a carefree crime film with an overabundance of blood and gore, then I would definitely recommend checking this one out. This was one of the few anime films screened at MIFF. The art style looked quite neat, so I decided to give it a shot. Visually, it's an absolutely beautiful film, capturing this aesthetic that really sucks you into the narrative. The story revolves around this child learning to deal with the death of her two parents. This is a theme that's been explored dozens of times, so in order to separate itself from the rest, it had to take a different approach. But unfortunately, the approach they do take isn't that interesting. While watching this, I couldn't help but think of other films that explore similar themes around learning to cope with the grief of losing someone you love in a more effective manner, such as My Neighbor Totoro and Your Name. Although this isn't the key theme in neither of those films, the possibility of losing someone is an anxiety that both characters have to face. The approach these examples take lead to a much more emotionally packed experience, where I do actually feel something, whereas in this, the approach was too generic and by the books for me to connect to the narrative in any meaningful way. It just used elements and ideas borrowed from much better films, and that made it difficult for me to stay interested. It's not a bad film by any means. Overall, I actually found it alright from a filmmaking level. It's just the approach they took made me feel kinda distant and detached from it all, making it difficult to stay entertained. This is the second feature film by Australian director Jennifer Kent, who is known for the popular horror film The Babadook, which has built a seriously large following over the years. I actually covered it on my Best Outside of Hollywood series, having found it quite an effective horror film, so as you may expect, I was interested to see what she'll do next. The Nightingale is a revenge story set in the late 1800s, when the Europeans first colonised Australia, and the narrative revolves around a convict that was heavily taken advantage of in this process, being controlled and raped by men in horribly horrific ways that lead to her building the motivation to hunt these people down, with the help of an Aboriginal that has been hurt and taken advantage of by these men in similar ways. It's one of those films that is incredibly difficult to watch, but at the same time worth it for the experience you'll get out of it. It explores some issues in a very explicit manner that most major studios have shied away from. With that being said, some scenes are designed to get a very strong emotion out of you that you won't like experiencing, so just be prepared for that going into this. I would recommend this to everyone at least once in their lifetime, but if you are sensitive to certain topics, then maybe have a look at the certification rating details before you go into it, which I'll link in the description below. That will give you an idea of what to expect. The film itself is incredibly well made. It's shot well, the performances all around are great, the pacing is very smooth. My only real complaint is that at some points when the protagonist breaks into song, it doesn't feel justified or necessary, which took me out of the experience 1 or 2 times. But aside from that, this is easily some of Jennifer Kent's best work, and I can't wait to see what she does next. This was one of the surprise screenings announced at the last second, in which I decided to swap over with Sunset. It's another film distributed by A24, in which is a company having built quite a reputation for funding original and interesting projects. This one in particular is from one of the co-directors of Swiss Army Man, Daniel Schwinert. As you may know, that film is a personal favourite of mine that I love coming back to, so I wasn't going to miss an opportunity to see another comedy by one of these directors on the big screen. Overall, it was quite a fun and entertaining experience that works on the basis of its dedication in keeping a straight face, while exploring an absolutely absurd situation that can't be taken in the slightest bit seriously. The comedic aspect comes from how strictly it structures itself as a drama, trusting the audience to see the humour in this approach, and to be fair, it works quite well, although not to the level I was hoping. I think one of its biggest flaws is some of its inspirations for the narrative are a bit too clear and on the nose, in some cases to the point where they directly reference it. This takes away from its overall originality, as you see it's just mixing narrative elements of other films and TV shows together without establishing its own identity in the process. As a result, I can't really call it a great film, but it's one I definitely enjoyed and plan to come back to. If you're interested in checking it out, I would recommend going in as blind as you possibly can, as it does have a plot twist that can be very amusing when you don't see it coming. This is a very interesting, unique, and outrageously bizarre animation film. The best way I can put it is it's the kind of thing you would expect to come across scrolling through TV channels at 4 in the morning. It contains a very dark sense of humour, coming off as blatantly disgusting and absurd even to the most vulgar of people. It contains this very interesting paper cutout aesthetic that it combines with other forms of fluid to create certain effects, which I found quite interesting as someone who's attempted to create films in the field of animation and knows the difficulty and risk of achieving these kinds of effects. Its artistic approach is really its greatest achievement and is what kept me engaged in the film, as everything else around it doesn't quite work. The attempts at humour felt a bit too repetitive and on the nose, like it was trying too hard to get a response out of the audience. It felt like it dragged out the narrative a bit too much and would definitely have worked much better as a 10 to 20 minute short, but overall I was never exactly bored or frustrated with the film. There wasn't enough here for me to like it on any level, but if you want a very bizarre and original experience that doesn't hold back in the slightest, then you might get some enjoyment out of this. That's all the screenings I went to this year. There was a lot of big films I missed out on, most notably In Fabric, The Farewell, Monos, Greener Grass, and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. But overall, I'm very happy with what I got to see. I came across some really great films that I got to see before most other people will. I hope some of these get wide releases because they definitely deserve it. If I'm going to rank my top 3 favourite films, number 1 would have to be Sorry We Missed You, number 2 would be The Souvenir, and number 3 would be The Nightingale. If you plan to see any of these films, I'd recommend those most. Thank you everyone for watching this video. It's definitely something I would love to do again next year. Please like and share this video on social media so we can introduce new people to the channel who might potentially find this content interesting. And of course, if you haven't yet, do consider subscribing to the channel and following me on Twitter, where I will keep you up to date on the content I'm working on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.